A routine trans-Pacific flight transforms into a nightmare when a sudden explosion rips part of the fuselage at 41,000 feet. With half the cabin open to the void, the captain has only 32 seconds to make decisions that will determine whether 523 people will see the sun rise again. Between the chaos of explosive decompression, the deafening roar of wind and systems failing one by one, he'll need to find superhuman strength to execute the impossible. There are moments in aviation when time dilates in a cruel way. 32 seconds. That was the interval between the explosion that ripped a 9-square-meter piece from the side of my aircraft and the moment I managed to stabilize that mutilated machine. 32 seconds that felt like a frozen eternity, where every wrong decision would mean the death of 523 people. This is the story of how I learned that heroism isn't in grand actions, but in small training exercises repeated 1,000 times. My name is Rick, and I've been flying commercial aircraft for 23 years. That March morning, I was commanding a Boeing 747-400, one of the world's largest passenger aircraft. I can't reveal specific flight details, but I can say we were crossing the Pacific on a transoceanic route, carrying 523 souls on board between passengers and crew. The day had started like any other. Check-in at the operations base at 4 in the morning, weather briefing indicating favorable conditions, pre-flight inspection with no abnormalities. My co-pilot was Frank, an experienced pilot I'd flown with dozens of times. We had that silent synchronicity that only years in the cockpit provide. We took off on schedule, and the climb was smooth as silk. We reached our cruise level at 41,000 feet, more than 12 kilometers above the ocean. Up there, the world seems unreal. The sky is so deep blue it borders on violet, and below, the carpet of clouds stretches as far as the eye can see, resembling an infinite ocean of cotton. We were about 5 hours into the flight, already halfway through the oceanic crossing. The cabin was dark, most passengers sleeping or watching movies. The flight attendants had just finished the second meal service. I was reviewing some performance data on the flight computer when it happened. There's no sound in the world that compares. First, a sharp crack as if someone had snapped a giant branch inside the aircraft. Then the roar. A primal, violent roar that swallowed all other sounds. The plane shuddered violently, throwing me against the seatbelt with enough force to knock the breath out of me. My eyes raced to the instruments in an automatic reaction trained by thousands of hours. Cabin pressure dropping precipitously, alert systems screaming in chorus, red lights flashing across the entire panel. The aircraft began rolling right, a slow but inexorable movement, as if a giant hand were trying to flip it upside down. Frank looked at me, and in that instant, without needing words, we shared the same terrifying thought. We had a catastrophic failure in mid-flight over the ocean, hundreds of miles from the nearest land. The oxygen masks dropped automatically throughout the aircraft. The noise was deafening. Wind howled through some opening in the fuselage with a ferocity that seemed intent on ripping the entire cockpit away. Objects flew through the flight deck. Navigation charts, pens, even the checklist that had been beside me simply disappeared, sucked out of the aircraft by an invisible force. "Explosive decompression!" I shouted to Frank, my voice barely audible over the wind's roar. My hands were already moving in automatic sequences, born from countless simulator hours. Oxygen mask on face, check flow, establish communication through the mask, all of this in a matter of seconds. The aircraft continued rolling right. I pushed the yoke left with force, but the response was sluggish, heavy. Something was terribly wrong with the flight controls. The attitude indicator showed we were at a 40-degree bank angle, dangerously close to the point where we could enter loss of control. "We've lost the right rear section!" The cabin chief's voice exploded on the intercom, loaded with barely contained panic. "There's a hole in the fuselage. We can see the sky through it." My blood ran cold. A hole in the fuselage at 41,000 feet. The pressure differential between the aircraft's interior and exterior at that altitude is brutal. Air inside the plane was being sucked out at tremendous speed, and with it, anything that wasn't secured, including people. "How many injured?" I managed to ask, fighting to keep the aircraft level. "I don't know, it's chaos back here. We've got passengers hanging from their seatbelts, luggage flying, ceiling panels falling." Frank was already on the radio, transmitting our emergency. "Mayday! Mayday! Mayday!" We have explosive decompression, partial loss of controls, initiating emergency descent. The next decision was critical. We needed to descend, and fast. Every second at that altitude, we were exposed to temperatures of 60 degrees below zero, and an atmosphere so thin our consciousness would begin to fail within minutes, even with supplemental oxygen. But descending a 747 with part of the fuselage ripped away and compromised controls was like trying to land a flying building. I pulled the thrust levers, drastically reducing speed. Simultaneously, I pushed the yoke forward, initiating an emergency descent. The speed limit for a 747 is something we take very seriously. Exceeding maximum velocity with structural damage could result in complete disintegration of the aircraft. The plane began to fall. That's not an exaggeration. We were descending at more than 6,000 feet per minute, a rate that would make an unsuspecting passenger think we were in free fall. The altimeter spun counterclockwise like a crazed clock hand. 40,000 feet, 38,000, 35,000. That's when the second problem manifested. Engine number 3, the right outboard, began showing abnormal vibrations. The indicators showed rising temperature, oil pressure dropping. The initial explosion must have launched debris that damaged the engine. "Engine 3 showing failure," Frank announced, his voice tense but controlled. "Initiating shutdown procedure. A Boeing 747 can fly on 3 engines. It can even fly on 2 if necessary. But with serious structural damage, compromised controls, and now 1 less engine, we were entering unknown territory. No manual, no training, covers exactly this combination of factors. If you're following this story and feeling your heart race, imagine being inside that aircraft. Subscribe to the Caixa Preta channel for more real stories from the skies that will leave you breathless. My mind was working on multiple layers simultaneously. Layer 1, keep the aircraft controlled and descending. Layer 2, evaluate systems and make decisions about what to shut down, what to keep. Layer 3, calculate diversion options. Where could we land? Layer 4, stay calm, don't let panic take over. At 28,000 feet, something changed. Cabin pressure was finally equalizing with the external pressure, and the monstrous roar of wind began to diminish to a constant howl. It was still loud enough to require shouting to communicate, but at least we could think. "Frank, I need nearby airport options. Anything with a runway long enough for a 747. His fingers flew over the navigation system. "Closest is 340 nautical miles southeast, 3,200-meter runway. Fear it's tight for a heavy 747, but it's what we've got." Tight was an understatement. A loaded 747 normally needs at least 3,000 meters to land safely, and that's under normal conditions. With compromised controls and part of the fuselage missing, we'd be a metal bomb trying to stop on a strip of asphalt. But we had no choice. Plot direct course. Notify the tower we're going to need every emergency crew available in the region. We leveled at 12,000 feet. At that altitude, I could finally remove my oxygen mask and better assess the situation. I looked out the side window, and my stomach churned. I could see the damage. The fuselage was torn like paper, twisted metal edges pointing backward from wind force. It was a miracle the plane was still in one piece. The next minutes were a constant battle. The aircraft wanted to roll right because of aerodynamic asymmetry. Controls responded unpredictably. With every adjustment I made, I had to compensate with another adjustment 3 seconds later. It was like piloting a ship in a storm, where each wave demands a different correction. The cabin chief came back on the intercom. His voice was more controlled now, but I could hear the underlying trauma. "Captain, we did a count. We have 18 injured, 3 serious. We managed to stabilize everyone with the onboard medical kits. No losses so far." So far. The unspoken words hung in the air. We still needed to land this thing. We began the approach checklist, adapting each item to our unique situation. Normally an approach is a choreographed dance of standardized procedures. But there was nothing standard about this. We were improvising, using years of experience and training to create real-time solutions. The diversion airport tower gave us absolute priority. All other aircraft were diverted, runways were closed. Ambulances and fire trucks positioned themselves along the main runway. From above, I could see the emergency lights flashing like red and blue fireflies. The final approach was the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire career. Every movement on the controls needed to be amplified, anticipated. The aircraft resisted, fought against me like a wounded animal. Speed needed to be perfect. Too fast and we could run off the runway, too slow and we could stall and crash. 1,000 feet, Frank announced. His voice was mechanical, professional, but I knew that man long enough to hear the tension hidden there. 500 feet, speed 165 knots, on profile. I could see the runway now, a strip of grey concrete surrounded by white lights. It looked small, impossibly small for that wounded metal giant I was trying to control. 300 feet, drifting right, correct. I pushed the yoke left, too much. The aircraft rolled more than I wanted. I corrected right. The ground was approaching rapidly. 100 feet, 50, 10... The main landing gear touched the ground with an impact that shook the entire aircraft. It wasn't the smoothest landing of my career, not by a long shot. But in that moment, feeling the wheels touch solid concrete was like hearing a choir of angels. "Reversers!" I shouted. Frank activated the reversers on the functioning engines, and I felt the tremendous braking force push me against the belt. The aircraft vibrated violently. Metal groaned. Audio alerts competed for attention. The runway consumed itself beneath us at a terrifying speed. 120 knots, 100 knots, 80 knots. I pressed the brakes to the maximum, feeling them heat under my feet. I could see the end of the runway approaching. There was grass beyond it. Beyond the grass, a fence. Beyond the fence, 60 knots, 40 knots, 20 knots. The aircraft finally stopped. Complete and absolute silence took over the cockpit for an instant. Frank and I looked at each other. His eyes were watery. So were mine. Then the world exploded into action. Fire trucks surrounded the plane in seconds, spraying foam as a precaution. Ambulances positioned at the doors. Emergency teams invaded the aircraft, organizing the evacuation of the injured. I shut down the remaining engines. The silence was deafening after hours of constant roar. My hands trembled uncontrollably now that adrenaline was beginning to drain. I tried to release my seatbelt 3 times before succeeding. My fingers simply wouldn't obey. I left the flight deck on wobbly legs. The sight of the passenger cabin hit me like a punch. Seats ripped out, ceiling panels fallen. Oxygen masks hanging like vines. And the hole, that horrible hole in the fuselage through which I could see the evening sky. But there was something else, something that made my tears finally fall. Passengers helping passengers, people embracing, crying, laughing. Strangers who had faced death together and now celebrated together the miracle of being alive. The following hours were a blur of debriefings, reports, medical exams, and interviews with investigators. I learned that the explosion had been caused by metal fatigue in a fuselage section, a microscopic defect that grew over years and thousands of pressurization cycles until finally yielding catastrophically at 41,000 feet. The resulting hole was 9 square meters. 9 square meters of metal ripped from an aircraft in mid-flight. The engineers who examined the wreckage later told me it was an aerodynamic miracle the plane hadn't completely disintegrated. The remaining structure had withstood forces it wasn't designed for. The seriously injured were immediately transported to local hospitals. All recovered completely over the following weeks. The passenger closest to the hole had literally been sucked against his seatbelt with such force that he had deep bruises. But the belt held. That small piece of reinforced fabric saved his life. In the days that followed, as investigators methodically dismantled every aspect of the incident, I found myself revisiting those initial 32 seconds repeatedly. 32 seconds between the explosion and the moment I managed to stabilize the aircraft. 32 seconds where the line between life and death for 523 people hung by a razor's edge. Many called me a hero. The media, the passengers, even other pilots. But every time someone used that word, I cringed a little, because the truth is I didn't do anything heroic. I simply did what I was trained to do. You know what really saved me in those 32 seconds? It wasn't courage, it wasn't some special talent, it was repetition. It was the 13th decompression simulator I'd done, even thinking I already knew everything. It was the 100th time I mentally reviewed emergency procedures, even when it seemed tedious. It was the 1,000th landing I practiced, perfecting every small movement. There's a phrase in aviation that says, years of boredom interspersed with seconds of pure terror. But there's something that phrase doesn't capture. Those years of boredom, The repetitive training, the monotonous checklists, the constant procedure reviews aren't boredom. They're preparation. They're building, brick by brick, a wall of competence that will protect you when the impossible happens. Because the impossible happens, it shouldn't, but it does. And when it happens, you won't have time to think, to plan, to prepare. You'll only have the reflexes you built in thousands of hours of practice. I talked at length with Frank in the weeks after the incident. He told me something I'll never forget. You know why we made it? Because when everything fell apart, we didn't have to think. Our bodies already knew what to do. Our hands moved before our brains could panic. He was right. Those initial 32 seconds were pure instinct. Instinct built on foundations of rigorous training. The only reason I didn't freeze, didn't panic, was because my body was executing choreography I'd practiced so many times, it became part of me. That made me rethink everything about how we approach preparation. In modern life, we tend to seek shortcuts, quick solutions, hacks that let us skip steps. But some things can't be accelerated. Some skills need to be forged in the slow fire of constant repetition. If you're enjoying this account, don't forget to subscribe to Caixa Preta. Every week we bring real stories from those who live aviation, with all the challenges, fears and triumphs that happen thousands of feet above the ground. I also learned something about leadership that day. In the most critical moment, when everything is falling apart, people don't need a superhero. They need someone who stays calm, who makes decisions based on process, not panic, who trusts the training. The cabin chief, whose name I can't reveal but whose courage I'll never forget, also executed his role perfectly. While I fought with the controls, he was in the cabin transforming chaos into order. Organizing the crew, caring for the injured, keeping passengers as calm as possible given the impossible situation. And the passengers, the passengers. After we landed, many came to thank me, but I should have been thanking them. Their resilience, their courage under terrible circumstances, their humanity in helping each other. That was also part of the reason we all survived. There was a moment a few days later that crystallized everything for me. I was at the hotel where the company housed us while investigations continued. It was late at night, and I couldn't sleep, still processing everything. I went down to the lobby and found one of the passengers, a woman about 50 years old whom I recognized from the debriefings. She was sitting alone looking out the window. I sat beside her and we stayed in silence for a few minutes. Then she said, "You saved my life. I was going home to see my grandkids. Now I'll be able to do that. How can I thank you?" I thought carefully before responding. Don't thank me. Thank every instructor who had the patience to teach me. Thank every engineer who designed redundant systems in that aircraft. Thank every mechanic who maintains it meticulously. Thank your seatbelt that held you when the explosion happened. Aviation is safe not because of heroes, but because of thousands of people doing their job correctly, day after day without glamour. She smiled, tears in her eyes. But you were there when it mattered, and that's the truth I carry with me. Yes, I was there. Yes, I made the right decisions, but I could only do that because 1,000 people before me did their job correctly, because designers created redundant systems, because engineers calculated structural resistances, because instructors had the patience to teach me the same procedures repeatedly, because regulators established rigorous safety standards. Real heroism in aviation isn't in dramatic moments. It's in the mechanic who spends an extra hour inspecting a component because something didn't seem quite right. It's in the engineer who redoes calculations for the 10th time to ensure accuracy. It's in the instructor who insists on one more training cycle, even when the pilot is already exhausted. I returned to flying 3 months after the incident. Many people asked if I was afraid. The honest answer is yes, but not a paralyzing fear, a healthy fear, one that keeps me alert, that reminds me never to be complacent. The first time I sat again in a 747 flight deck, my hands trembled touching the controls. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. Then I began the pre-flight checklist, item by item, methodical, complete. And in that familiar ritual, in that sequence I'd done thousands of times, I found my peace. Because that's what training does. It doesn't make you invincible. It doesn't make you immune to fear. But it gives you a way back. It gives you a structure to lean on when everything else is falling apart. It gives you the confidence that, even in the worst scenarios, You have tools to handle the situation. Frank also returned to flying. We never talk much about that day when we're together. We don't need to. There's a silent understanding between us, a connection forged in the fire of that shared experience. He's one of the most competent pilots I know, and if I had to choose someone to be beside me in another emergency, it would be him. The official investigation took 18 months to complete. The resulting recommendations led to significant changes in inspection procedures for older aircraft, particularly regarding metal fatigue. That incident, as traumatic as it was, helped make aviation safer for millions of future passengers. And that, in the end, is the legacy I choose to carry. Not the story of the hero pilot, but the story of how a system worked. How training, technology, procedures, and yes, a bit of luck, combined to transform what should have been a tragedy into a case study in survival. Today, when I give talks to new pilots, I always tell this story. But I focus on the 32 seconds. 32 seconds that defined the fate of 523 lives. 32 seconds that were possible because of thousands of hours of preparation. And I tell them, don't train to be heroes. Train to be competent. Competence, repeated thousands of times until it becomes instinct, is true heroism. It's what will save lives when everything goes wrong. Sometimes on sleepless nights, I still hear that roar. I still feel the aircraft rolling under my fingers, resisting, fighting. And I ask myself, if it happened again tomorrow, would I be ready? The answer always is the same, yes, because tomorrow I'll do exactly what I did today. I'll train, I'll review, I'll prepare. Because when the 32 seconds come again, and they always come, I want my body to know what to do before my mind can doubt. This was the story of 523 lives preserved in 32 seconds of pure skill and preparation. If you want to keep hearing real accounts from the skies, with all the emotions, challenges and lessons that aviation teaches us, subscribe to the Caixa Preta channel. Leave us in the comments. Would you have the courage to fly again after experiencing something like this?